Okay, so welcome everybody to the November seminar for the Western Center for Agricultural Health and Safety. Next slide. As we get started, I'll go over a few housekeeping items. First, this is a reminder that the seminar is being recorded, both in English and Spanish, which means that you'll be able to share it with others in the next few days. All participants are muted, and you can use the chat feature in order to submit questions or comments throughout the presentation. And we will have about 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to answer questions. As you have heard, we have Spanish interpretation available, and you can choose the English or Spanish from the interpretation icon at the bottom. We also have closed captioning available, and you can select the CC icon below and click Show Subtitle. Next slide. If you have not joined us before or you're new to interacting with our center, the Western Center for Agricultural Health and Safety is based here at UC Davis. We are one of 12 NIOSH-funded ag centers, and our mission is to improve the health and safety of agricultural workers in the West through research, trainings, and tailored outreach. And today is an example of our goal to be responsive to the on-the-ground realities that are happening in agriculture. And unfortunately, bird flu is something that is definitely making the news and being experienced in many workplaces in California. Next slide. So I'm really happy to introduce our two speakers. We have Dr. Jeff Bender, who is the director of one of our partner ag centers. And then we have Dr. Kristen Cummings from the California Department of Public Health. They'll go one after another, and then we will have time for questions. So Jeff, I'm going to send it over to you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I actually look forward to the conversation and the questions that we will get. Bear with me as I try to pull up the slides here. And Heather, does that look okay to you?
It looks perfect. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. Well, folks, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm a veterinarian by training and also an infectious disease epidemiologist as well. And actually, I've been working on influenza for the past 2 to 3 decades of my life. And so it is a particular issue that continues to rear its ugly head to us. And what I've been asked to do is really just to provide a little bit of an overview of the situation that we've had in Minnesota. So I'm going to just provide some recent case studies, briefly mention the current situation, and really turn it over to our California Department of Public Health folks to talk about the human situation, and also at the end just talk a little bit about some of the activities that we're doing to try to help workers, especially here in the upper Midwest. So traditionally, our thinking about influenza has changed dramatically over the past 30 years. We talk about getting a seasonal influenza shot, and that's usually what we call either an influenza A or an influenza B. And we haven't really talked about influenza being in cattle. There's an influenza D that was in cattle, but now things have changed. And that gets to that comment that I have, is that it's really changed dramatically over the years. There are some strains that are actually pathogenic to birds and especially poultry, and we refer to those as low pathogenic avian influenza and high pathogenic avian influenza. So that's some of the terms that you may be hearing when we think about influenza. So my first case study is a situation that we experienced in 2015. So this was a highly pathogenic, so it was killing birds, here in Minnesota. And I wanted just to briefly describe kind of the situation here and why it is significant and the impact and why we're continuing to deal with avian influenza. So this was something detected in 2015. There was over 100 premises that were detected. Most of these were turkey operations, and the cost was actually very substantial, with over nearly $650 million in lost turkey and egg production. But also, we forget about the worker impacts and basically the cost and loss of wages and salaries and the benefits for those workers, and basically the number of jobs that actually were more directly affected. So just to highlight that this was kind of a big deal. Some of our study was to look at farms that got affected versus farms that didn't get affected. And so there's a couple things that we really noticed when we did our investigation. One was that the closer you were to positive farms was more likely that your farm could be affected. So that was, important. The other was there tilling done, or was there aerosolization potentially activities before the farm was affected? Also, was there biosecurity gaps? Were there people coming to and from your farm? Was there certain activities that would bring people on? And so they were noticing that was a risk for some farms being affected. And this is the traditional way that we generally have seen avian influenza outbreaks. The current situation is actually a little bit different now that we have dairy cattle affected from this. The other issue that we saw in this particular scenario or situation is that it was very windy. And so it raised a lot of questions and concerns. Could we have aerosolization? And so, often we think of basically more direct or, a fomite or something getting on equipment or clothing, or that being the primary way. So this was another lesson that we learned from that. The next scenario that I wanted to mention was the issue of kind of occupational and community hazards due to live animal markets. These are something that we have seen and actually represents a different type of influenza and something we've experienced here in Minnesota. And this is a situation where various ethnic groups can go to the market and actually pick out their animals that they want to have for, and it would be a holiday or a festival or something along those lines. And so we've seen periodic human cases that have been associated with these live animal markets. And so because of this, basically the Minnesota Department of Health, the Department of Agriculture, and the University of Minnesota got together to try to better understand these risks and hopefully help protect the workers as well as basically patrons that would go to these live animal markets. So we collected samples from workers, from pigs at the market, and then also the environment from that market. So this would be a picture of what this live animal market would look like. So a person could walk here and they could actually pick out a pig if they wanted to. And so occasionally we were seeing cases of humans with what we call swine influenza strains. So we were interested to know why that was the case and what we could do to maybe protect those patrons. So one of the things is to look at workers. And so we would sample the workers on a weekly basis and try to determine, did they have influenza or not? And sure enough, we saw a fair number of the workers actually had influenza. And most likely it was the human form, the seasonal influenza. But occasionally it would be the swine form. So in other words, their nasal passages could be contaminated with, this swine form that was moving around. So we're always concerned about mixing of different viruses together. And so that's why we looked at that. Also, this is a very busy slide here, but it highlights a couple things. One is that we took samples from a number of different places. So the environment, from the pigs themselves, and basically we try to say, could we isolate the virus? And then what type of virus that we could find? And really the bottom line message is, because this is such a busy slide, I'm just going to go to the next one, is that influenza viruses are really common in the pigs, and they were readily contaminate the environment, and that there was a number of different types that were there. And so it really allowed for that interspecies transmission of avian influenza. And that's the same concern that we have with the current situation, is that intermixing of the viruses. So the other scenario that I wanted just to briefly mention was that with this new change, with this new virus, this H5N1 over the past couple of years, we've noticed something different. And that is that it's moved towards other animals. And one of the animals that we've noticed is that it's affecting not only just chickens and turkeys, but actually raptors or eagles and hawks and falcons, etc. And so, in particular, our center or wildlife center was actually noticing a large number of birds that actually were very sick. Most of those would die and actually were also positive for influenza. So those are just a quick couple case studies here in Minnesota, just to highlight, what we've known traditionally about influenza. So highly pathogenic avian influenza has been labeled bird flu. And in particular, the H5N1 that we hear in the news has actually been circulating globally over the past 20 years. However, in the last couple of years, we've seen kind of a spillover of birds to mammals and more specifically livestock. And so that's really what the concern, especially in California, is right now. If you look at the outbreak, over the past couple of years, again, it's primarily been in poultry, and that includes backyard chickens and also big commercial operations, and really has been documented across the United States in 48 states with well over 100 million birds that have been affected. So this is actually a significant problem, especially for the poultry industry. What's unique is this spillover now to cattle. And this is something very unusual, very different. And this is the first time it's been documented throughout really the world. What we know about this in cattle, we're still learning, is that these cows will actually go off feed. They decrease their milk production. They tend to have very thick and clotted milk. And they have a number of other conditions that just says that they're just not doing right. These animals, unlike poultry, don't just generally die though, and so they tend to just get sick. They're sick for a period of weeks, and then subsequently, hopefully, they get better. In some initial done from Michigan, they tried to determine what's happening on these farms, and what they've noticed is that animal movement has played a key role in how these farms become infected. The initial farms in Michigan actually received cattle from Texas, and subsequently found out that they came from a herd that was positive in Texas. They noticed that movement of cattle has been one of the primary driving factors. They also know that visitors or shared equipment and vehicles can play, again, another role in sharing between farms. So very similar to what we see with poultry. Also, that many of the workers actually might be working in multiple in farm environments. So one might be working in poultry and then later in the day work in a dairy, or they might be doing between work. And so that plays a significant role. And then also we're worried about what we call paradomestic, those animals that might be around the farm that might serve as ways to move the virus. And so, that could be, possums and other birds or raccoons as well. The other thing that's been interesting is that many farms have cats, and cats might be fed milk from the farm itself. And so cats, in a sense, have been sentinels of activity for this new strain that's H5N1. And that a lot of these cats actually have diseases that affect their brain or neurologic disease, and they die. They either are consuming, maybe a dead bird, or they might have picked up, from raw milk. And so this has been another significant finding with that. So one of the things that at least the U.S. Department of Agriculture and other experts are saying is that we need to think about farm biosecurity. How do we protect the individual, the worker, and what do we do with the herd to protect the animals from getting it, or trying to minimize its spread? How do we prevent movement between farms, and how do we clean and disinfect? These are all key things to think about. So some examples of that we've been telling farmers is one, be well aware of your state regulations. Consider who's coming onto and off of the farm. So a dairy might have hoof trimmers, they might have a nutritionist, they might have breeding technicians. Also, we want the healthy animals treated first versus the sick animals. So treat the sick pen last. And then there's a number of resources that will encourage producers to think about or to reach out to if they have questions on what are the best practices. Now, this map is already wrong. We are, over 400 cases, you know, as of, I think it's like 440 or well over that, as well as being found in 15 states. So these numbers have changed pretty dramatically. They change pretty dramatically every day. I've actually kind of given up trying to keep up on a daily basis because it's changing. Also, this is just a chart of basically when the first case was identified in March and basically the number of cases. You can see over the past couple of weeks, it really has accelerated, and that's largely because of what's been happening in California. Just briefly, and I'll really defer to our California Department of Public Health folks, is that humans have been identified with this. And for the most part, these have been folks that are not severely ill and oftentimes just usually have a redness in the eye or conjunctivitis. There have been 40 some cases, a fair percentage that have been found associated with poultry operations or cleaning poultry operations, a fair number who have been working on dairies that have cases as well. And there is one situation in Missouri where an individual has no animal contact that they can identify. The good news is that there's no evidence of person-to-person transmission. So if somebody got this and then they share it with their other family members, we haven't seen that documented to date, but we are worried and we are monitoring that situation. Also, there has been some recommendations on what personal protective equipment workers should have. This is a little bit controversial because if you've ever worked in a dairy, sometimes it could be hot, it could be steamy, and so having to, have, a mask, other things makes your work difficult. And so this is actually an area that we need better, probably personal protective equipment, and also recommendations, best practice recommendations as to what is the best way to protect the worker in this regard. As you can imagine, with this outbreak, because it's new, it's changing, it's influenza, there are a number of challenges. One is just the regulatory impacts on the industry. The other is to understand the transmission dynamics because they've been changing. Recognizing also that milking equipment likely plays a role in the transmission because we know that the udder of the cow sheds a large number of viruses. And also, we don't really know the role of wildlife to maintain and to spread. What is the correct personal protective equipment that can be used that's best for being able to do the work as well as protect the worker. Also, the education piece, best education and awareness of the issue. Raw milk, we know, is a risk, and so discouraging raw milk consumption is an issue. And then basically there are varied state regulations across the United States, especially with the movement of milk and the movement of cattle. So the last thing I just briefly wanted to mention is just the training of immigrant dairy workers is some of the work that we've done to actually support this. Now, we clearly recognize that the immigrant dairy worker is very important to the dairy industry. They largely make up the majority of the workforce that is working on dairies and actually most of the milk. We also know that these agricultural workers come from varied backgrounds, often from Mexico and Central America. They have a number of vulnerabilities that we're concerned about. One is they're concerned about their immigration status, their language barriers, how are they adjusting culturally, being away from their family, their housing situation, their health insurance, also that they work on a very risky job, and oftentimes they don't really have training to actually do the job that they're been asked to do. So we've actually, in partnership with the National Farm Medicine Center and Migrant Clinicians Network, tried to develop some training materials for dairy workers. One is for them to be aware of the hazards, two, to how to work around animals, three, just to recognize the importance of machinery and equipment and some of the risks that go with that. Also to understand their rights, workers' rights and responsibility. And then also lastly, to be aware of kind of some of the chemicals and then confined space hazards that might be there in working with dairies as well. So we provide this training usually free of charge to the producers, and they usually will try to meet with those workers to try to give them some training in this regard. The success of this training is largely driven by basically meeting workers where they're at. So coming to them, meeting them, and that they're getting paid for these training sessions, trying to make sure it's concise in their language, and then also in a manner or materials that actually they can understand and appreciate. So that's key. We've done during the pandemic, it actually restricted our ability, but basically in 19 farms over the last couple of years that we visited, these are larger dairies, not as big as some of the dairies in California, and they have on average about 20 some workers, and the majority of these workers are going to be Hispanic, and many of these Hispanic workers will actually be housed on farms. So very similar probably to the situation in California. We've trained about 360 workers so far. Off their primary language or preferred language is Spanish, but we're recognizing that that doesn't account for some individuals where Spanish is not their primary language. We also note that really about 40% of them have an 8th grade education or less. And so we're really trying to make sure the materials are appropriate to these individuals as well. Some of the things that we've observed so far is that many of these folks have not been in the United States very long, usually less than a year. Their time working on a dairy, is limited, so they don't have a lot of experience. Also, if they had any previous health and safety training on dairies, half of them said that they did get some training before they started their job. And then when asked if they were ever injured at work on the dairy, unfortunately, a fair percentage of them said that they were. So not only are we dealing with a new virus and a new issue, but also we have other injuries and illnesses that can occur on these dairies. So the key findings that we have is that that when we've done these trainings, it really enhanced the health and safety discussion, oftentimes between the producer and the worker. It really provided a nice forum for discussion, and actually it increased the health and safety for those workers. They had a better understanding of some of those hazards and risks on the farm. For the sake of time, I won't read some of the producer or worker comment, but I did want to make an assumption that everybody has been working on a farm, and so I just wanted to take a brief moment to talk about what dairy workers do. As you can imagine, they move cows, they're milking cows, they're treating cows, they're doing cleanup, they're scraping the cow pens, they're cleaning out. They might be feeding or caring for calves. They might be operating equipment like skid steer loaders to move feed, and they're also feeding cows. So they have a number of jobs that they might be doing on the farm. They also might be doing crop work as well on many dairies, raising the food for those cattle. Also, many people don't really appreciate what dairies look like now. It's changed very much than what we did 50 years ago. So we have rotating parlors. So basically a cow will step on and basically will be milked in a very timely manner and then be shifted off. Oftentimes they're lower, so the workers are standing below, and so they might be, you know, potentially getting peed on or manure on themselves. They have a chance to get stepped on. They're also down by the udder. So, again, the udder is where we know that the majority of the virus would be as well. And so that's why precautions and personal protective equipment is important. Also, just to recognize that we've created a number of resources to actually help support these workers to understand some of the hazards on farm, especially in Spanish and in English. So this program is just one. There are other folks across the country that are doing this work. And as you can imagine, on a dairy, there are many challenges for safety and injury protection. And then when you think about this changing workforce, we need to be really creative in how we engage, educate, and protect the producer and the worker. And the key is really making sure that we have cultural and language appropriate trainers, as well as material to help build trust and buy-in to best protect those workers. So just to remind you, and I apologize, this is very quick, is that influenza viruses are constantly changing, and that the detection of influenza viruses in new animals represents what we call a spillover to other potential reservoirs, and concern that it could create potentially a new pandemic. And so there's a real need for broad surveillance of humans and animals really to monitor and best respond to this emerging situation that we currently have. Some activities that we currently are doing here in Minnesota, one, we're surveying our Minnesota and dairy producers to kind of understand what their risks are and how we best can support them. We're actually updating our outreach and educational materials in conjunction with our extension folks, and to know how best that we can support folks through our current training methods. With that, just to let you know that we have a number of materials that we put together for folks and in varying ways to help support workers and producers. With that, Heather, I am hoping that I've given enough time, especially to our California Department of Health colleagues.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Bender. I really appreciated the overview and introduction for many of us who have not been working in this area for a long time. And the pictures were also incredibly helpful to be able to visualize workplaces where we are not typically spending our time. I would like to invite Dr. Cummings to, there we go, share screen and go ahead with your presentation.
Great, thank you. I will, as I pull up my slides, I just want to thank Dr. Bender for that terrific presentation. As you were saying, I think it's really important, the fact that, as he said, these are hazardous environments to begin with. And bird flu is just adding to that, layering on another hazard to that situation. So thank you again for the opportunity to participate. I am here on behalf of the California Department of Public Health, and we have been working as part of a multi-agency response to bird flu or avian influenza within the state of California. And as I said, multiple agencies have been involved, including the California Department of Food and Agriculture, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Cal OSHA. And I work at a branch at the Department of Public Health called the Occupational Health Branch. And we have been contributing to this response in terms of worker health and safety. So this is just a brief agenda of what I'll talk about today. I want to give an update on bird flu and dairy cows in California, highlight important workplace health and safety issues, and then emphasize the importance of daily health checks that are going on with the support of local and state public health. So to give you an update on where things stand, you heard a little bit from Dr. Bender about avian influenza or bird flu nationally. Specifically in California, we are seeing this virus in dairy cows and poultry. The first 3 California dairy farms with infected cows were identified at the end of August. In the 2 months since then, we have confirmed bird flu in dairy cows in 203 cattle herds, as well as 3 commercial poultry producers, 4 commercial broilers, and 1 backyard flock. All of the detections in cattle have been in central California. On all of the affected dairies, our California Department of Food and Agriculture has issued what are called quarantine orders. So these orders require farm operators to implement biosecurity measures, movement restrictions, and surveillance testing. And all of these measures are aimed at preventing the virus from leaving the affected farm. In addition to those steps, dairies that produce raw or unpasteurized milk are required to test for bird flu regularly, and the test results have to be negative for the milk to be sold. Why are we concerned about bird flu? I think you got a good sense of this from Dr. Bender's talk, but bird flu can be serious in people and animals, and we're really still learning about how people are getting infected. To date, there have been there's no evidence of transmission between people, what we call person-to-person spread, but it may be possible that that could occur in the future, and so we are keeping a close eye and monitoring closely. In addition, because this is fairly new, we don't yet know if there are any long-term symptoms or effects from the virus, so we want to watch for that as well. Okay, I'll jump now to workplace health and safety. So how do dairy workers become infected with bird flu? Well, that may happen in several ways, and you can see some examples on this slide. First of all, touching something that's contaminated with the virus and then touching your eyes or nose or mouth is one way that the virus could gain entry into the body. Another way is if raw milk or another liquid that's contaminated with the virus splashes in the eyes, and we have seen eye infections with this virus. And then it's also possible people could become infected by eating or drinking or inhaling droplets that are contaminated. In terms of the actual human cases, so a few moments ago I told you about what we know about animal cases in California. In the dairy industry, there are over 17,000 dairy workers in our state, and the first 2 human cases of bird flu in California were confirmed by the CDC in early October. And as of today, there have been 20 confirmed and 1 probable human case. And these all happened in workers at dairy farms where there were known infected cows. Thankfully, symptoms have been mild and predominantly highlighted by eye redness or discharge. Some of the workers have had some mild respiratory symptoms or low-grade fever. There have not been any hospitalizations to date, so no cases that were sick enough to be hospitalized. And everyone who's been infected so far has fully recovered. We at CDPH, we produced an educational flyer on personal protective equipment, or PPE, and this was distributed to dairy and poultry farms with an offer of personal protective equipment that could be distributed. We recommend that workers wear personal protective equipment when they're in contact with or around sick cows, and that could include when they're milking, if they're working in the hospital pen where sick animals are being kept, if they're caring for feeding or watering animals, if they're working in the maternity pen, such as where calving is happening, if they're feeding calves colostrum, if they're handling raw milk, cleaning areas with the virus, or handling dead animals, dead carcasses. And what we recommend to protect against this virus is eye protection, and that would include goggles or a face shield. And we recommend an N95 respirator or other NIOSH-approved respirator, and that really goes back to that graphic that I showed you about the ways that transmission could happen, the ways that people could become infected. And one of them is through inhaling, breathing in the virus. And so a respirator protects against that. We do, as I said, have a handout in both English and Spanish that details this information. CDPH has supported distribution of PPE from our state stockpiles. To date, more than 3 million pieces of PPE have been distributed to 18 counties across the state to protect farm workers from bird flu. And that includes almost 2.5 million gloves, 600,000 respirators, 207,000 face shields and goggles, as well as more than 150,000 bouffant caps. Well, I mentioned earlier daily health checks, and these are really important for workers who have exposure to sick animals. And what daily health checks mean is checking in with workers who have contact with those sick animals to see if they themselves have symptoms of bird flu. And the check-in can be done by the employer or by the local health department. The other intention is to make that contact so that we can help workers and their families get quick access to testing and treatment for bird flu if it's needed. There is treatment available. It's an important and confidential way to help us find out about infections and to help us slow the spread of bird flu. This slide shows what we tell workers who work on a farm with sick animals and develop symptoms. First, share the information with your foreman or your employee health supervisor, and tell your health department. The local health department will ask about symptoms, help facilitate testing, or identify the best clinic for testing. The local health department can also arrange for free medicine called Tamiflu for the worker and household members if that's needed. And they can be part of the decision making in terms of whether the worker can continue working while waiting for the test results. If a worker does test positive for bird flu, they should stay home. The local health department can help determine when it's safe to be around family members and return to work. And workers may be eligible for paid sick leave. And one thing I'll add here is that the health department doesn't need a social security number or doesn't need to know about a person's immigration status to provide support. This is another flyer that we developed. This one is specifically providing information about symptoms and those health checks, and it's available in both English and Spanish. And as I said, it's important to know that treatment is available that can help people recover and avoid serious illness. So I'll end by saying that we are still learning about this virus. Our knowledge, we expect, will change over time as we learn more. The virus may also change and could become more serious. We will continue to talk about what we know currently in the coming days and weeks. And we do have a website where people can go for up-to-date information about bird flu in California. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Cummings. I'm going to now ask, perfect. Thank you, Jeff, for coming back on video. And a reminder to everyone that you can submit questions or comments, experiences in the chat, and I will be happy to facilitate a bit of a discussion. I know that I already have a list of questions. And so I'm going to start running through them, and in some cases it might be obvious which it's for, but I think we look forward to hearing from both of you. One has to do with beef cattle and whether or not there's surveillance or any observations of bird flu in beef cattle.
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is not really. So we haven't seen any evidence so far in beef cattle. Are there reasons for that? Unknown. There's clearly a need to probably look at beef cattle and specifically probably at least do some serology testing to see if there's exposure and actual evidence of that. Is it just because that dairy cattle are so, handled and regularly part of it versus beef cattle, which are on range? But the answer to that is no, we really don't.
I'm going to follow up sort of on a similar line, which is that, in addition to having farms where the animals are raised, we also have the processing plants. And what do we know about bird flu happening, for example, at poultry plants opposed to the farms?
Yeah, that's a good question. And what we do know is that when the difference, especially with poultry and the dairy cattle, is that when poultry get it, they die, usually with a highly pathogenic. So basically, these birds will die, and they probably won't go into the processing system, the processing line. Unlike the dairy animals, their milk is, and actually they can shed it for a period of time, so that risk is actually a little bit more ongoing. And so this is a little bit of concern for poultry producers, is that not only do they have the worry about wild birds potentially through migration bringing it, but also they might have neighbors now, dairy producers, who actually have this virus, and so they really do need to think about their precautions or protections to improve security so that they try to keep it out.
Great. I'm going to start to move us towards some of the workplace issues. And one question I have has to do with the different kinds of tasks. I really appreciated, Jeff, how you outlined and walked us through the variety of activities that are happening in dairies. I'm curious if you both could reflect on the different kinds of tasks, both at dairies and on poultry farms, and which ones are the greatest risk for exposure.
Maybe I'll start first, and then Kristen, please jump in. So I'll start with poultry. So again, the risk for poultry is that as soon as the virus is to be evident in the farm, then usually these birds die. So it's going to be those workers that are actually responsible for picking up these dead birds, cleaning up these dead birds, doing the culling. So in other words, a farm that might be exposed, they might have to kill those birds. So really, it's going to be that direct contact with those birds. And we saw that in the situation in Colorado, where basically they were doing the kind of the depopulation part. That's basically how we control this in poultry operations. And it was so hot that their PPE wasn't working, basically, and that so that was the issue. For dairy, what we do know is the viral load in the udder is really high. And so basically, if you're around milk, so colostrum is what we feed calves. It's usually the first milk that comes out of the cow right away when they give birth. Milking itself, it will be a risk, and also treating those sick animals. So, there is that potential exposure just in being in the pen with that animal if they're sick. So those are the type of activities that actually put an individual at risk, both at poultry and dairy. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Cummins.
Thank you. I don't have too much to add. I think that was a great description of what our experience is here. And I do think that most, if not all, of the cases that have happened in California dairy workers did involve milking as a task.
Great. Now I want to turn over to a couple important questions that we have received about worker exposure that might result in an infection. And so I know that neither of you are DIR or Cal OSHA, but and so I understand if we need to defer, and there might be folks on this call who can actually answer. But a question about whether or not workers who contract bird flu at work would be eligible for workers' comp. I don't know, Kristen or Dr. Cummings, if this is something that you're able to respond to.
I think what I can say is that in California, we do have a unique law called the Aerosol Transmissible Diseases Standard, or ATD, and that has a zoonotic piece to it that covers workers in agricultural settings and other settings. And so that law that we have in California requires the employer to provide certain services to the worker when a farm has been quarantined. And it's very possible that in addition, there would be coverage through workers' compensation. But I personally haven't followed up with the cases that have happened to find out if they pursued workers' comp.
Okay, and I am so happy that Erica Monterosa has raised her hand because I think she can confirm that workers are entitled to workers' comp. But I'll let you speak for the agency. Go ahead, Erica. Mhm. Yeah, can you say something, Erica?
Uh,
There we go.
oh, good. I was afraid that it wasn't working, but this is Erica Monterosa with the Department of Industrial Relations, and I am happy to confirm that if any worker experiences work-related illness or injury, including bird flu, they should immediately advise their supervisor about their symptoms as soon as they believe that it may be bird flu and connected with the workplace. And the employer within 24 hours should provide the worker with a workers' compensation claim form called the DWC-1. And if for some reason they do not do so, they can always reach out to our Division of Workers' Compensation Information and Assistance Officers for assistance. And more information is on our website at www.dir.ca.gov. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. And I do want to acknowledge that this presentation has focused a lot on an overview and the context, as well as the CDPH response. We do hope to have another session where we can get guidance and instruction from Cal OSHA and DIR on what employers should be doing and what workers have what protections they have. But as Erica said, any workplace injury or illness should be reported to a supervisor in order to initiate the workers' comp process. Okay, so many more questions. So one, Dr. Cummings, is there a special vaccine for bird flu?
I think I'll suffice it to say that it's not currently available. We do have seasonal influenza virus vaccine, and we do encourage people to get their seasonal flu vaccine, but there isn't currently a vaccine available specifically for bird flu.
Great, thank you. We also had a question about the movement of calves and of cattle, of animals. So does CDPH quarantine prevent movement to and from infected dairies and calf ranches, or what are the processes in place to prevent the spread?
So it's not CDPH that puts that quarantine in place. That's actually the California Department of Food and Agriculture. So we're not directly involved with that decision, but ultimately the quarantine is intended, as I said in the slides, to prevent movement and maintain the infection locally. The intention is to try to prevent the spread.
Great. I would like to ask Dr. Bender, you have been tracking this for the last several months. What can California producers, workers, state agencies learn from what you've seen in other states about what the future might hold for us?
You know, that's a good question. I think probably the biggest issue that we're seeing so far, and I look forward to from USDA to actually provide a little bit more of an update, especially on the California situation. I was pressing them. I actually saw them just the other day, and I said, "Hey, you know, we had the case series information on Michigan. What do we know out of Colorado, out of California, and what can you inform us as to, you know, why there's been such a dramatic, you know, between farm spread?" And so I hope that we'll have more with that. At this point, basically, I think what we've seen so far is the importance of biosecurity. We do see a spillover from dairy farms to poultry operations. So basically, that biosecurity is really important for poultry as well. And really thinking about who's coming to and from those farms and what precautions that we can take. How do we actually limit, basically, the vehicles as they move back and forth? Are there ways to do that? Another area that we need really guidance and help on is clearly the udder and milking actually has a lot of viruses. So milking equipment becomes easily contaminated. So how do we actually try to minimize contamination or reduce the contamination and try to really prevent what might be occurring? Also, the importance of early detection would be another issue that we need some guidance on. We have a number of barriers that we need to get through. I think that this is actually, unfortunately, well seated in the dairy industry. And I think that we see movement from USDA to look about broadly across the country. What are we going to do with this? Especially when you think about the movement of cattle. Many people raise their cattle in the south and they bring it to the north, and put them in the milking lines or, during their lactation or when they're milking. And then they'll go bring them off, or once they're done milking, then they'll go off feed or they'll change their feed and then move them back down to grow out. So those are all factors that need to be really thoughtfully considered about how do we move cattle, how do we test cattle before they come, how do we actually try to minimize contamination within the dairy.
Yeah, thank you. And that actually leads into a question about early detection. Are there any early detection technologies that are currently, in use to help prevent potential outbreaks?
Yeah, I think that we've got some evidence now. We're seeing a number of different things come to fruition. One is wastewater testing. I just saw in the news today that LA County had evidence of H5N1 in their wastewater. So where did that come from, or is part of the question. So we have some of that technology. We also are able to test bulk tank. So basically milk, that's been put together from a number of different cows. And so I think that actually has been one of the technologies that's being employed to basically monitor. And so I think that that'll be very helpful as well.
Great, thank you. We had a question early on, Dr. Cummings, about the probable case of a human case in California. Can you explain what that means?
Sure, and I did put information in the chat about that. But basically, when we classify a case, we use a definition that the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists and CDC have put together, and so they have different categories: confirmed and probable. So a probable case means that it meets certain parts of the definition, but laboratory testing didn't confirm. And so in that case, I believe the one probable case that we have met certain parts of the definition. Some initial testing was positive, but then when the sample was sent to CDC, which is what we do with all of our samples from the human cases, it was not confirmed there.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying. A question about disinfectants for use. And so are common dairy disinfectants effective against H5N1, with a follow-up specifically asking about peracetic acid?
Yeah, so the good news about influenza is that it's not that hard to kill. It doesn't survive very well in the environment. So yes, so most common disinfectants are good. Part of it is testing which ones you can use on which surfaces, and that and what's permissible, and something that we don't want to get into the milk system as well, or the into the milk. So making sure that that's appropriate. Your specific question of peracetic acid, I would venture to guess yes, but I'm not sure. That's a great question.
Okay, we are getting close to time, and so I wanted to let everyone know that we at UC Davis Western Center for Ag Health and Safety have received a large shipment of PPE, personal protective equipment, from CDPH. We have gloves, We will be getting face shields tomorrow, and we have N95 respirators. And so we are here and available to send those out to producers to provide them to their workers, to community organizations who can get them to workers in the community. But we are definitely happy to distribute those in any way we can. So Kimberly, Brian, Bill, all of you on here who I know are interacting with a lot of folks on the producer side, and then all of those of you who are here from community-based organizations, we would love to get PPE into your hands. We also are continually updating our resources on bird flu. And so if you have additional questions that we weren't able to tackle yet, please send them to us because I think, as Dr. Cummings said, this is an evolving topic. I will leave last words with you, Dr. Cummings and Dr. Bender. Is there any last piece of advice or recommendations that you can share with us?
I think, as I said earlier, we really encourage workers who are having symptoms and who are working with infected animals to come forward to report to their employer, report to public health, because that's how we can best understand what's going on and also provide support and care to that worker.
Yeah, the last thing that I would say is the importance of engaging trusted resources for those workers. And so I'm really trying to work with those groups that actually are trusted and that can really approach the workers and hopefully be able to engage them to really inform them what this is and how they can protect themselves.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. This was incredibly informative, and we will be following up by posting the recordings of today on YouTube, and we'll continue to follow up with everyone via our newsletters. Thank you, and we hope to see you on Monday. I think it's December 5th for our last seminar of 2024. Have a great day, everybody.